So previously, we were talking about the federal expenses, and we talked about the federal expenses being how much does the federal government spend? And then we dove into the federal receipts, which essentially those are just taxes. That's the money that the federal government is receiving in taxes. And then we started talking about the federal budget deficit. And remember that federal budget deficit is on an annual basis of is the federal government spending more than they're making? And if so, they go into a federal budget deficit for that particular year. It kind of resets every year. But what happens if they go and they have a federal budget deficit year over year over year like we've been seeing lately? Well, that actually leads into what is known as the national debt. So what the national debt is the sum of all of the outstanding federal government securities. So if you remember, whenever we have that federal budget deficit, the way that the federal government actually offsets that deficit is by selling U.S. Treasury bonds or selling these federal government securities. So whenever they're selling those federal government securities, it's basically them writing out this bond saying, we're going to take your money today and we're going to pay you back that money plus interest at a later date. So basically, we are the people who are the owners of that Treasury bond that the federal government sold it to. They're loaning the U.S. government money, and they're loaning it to them, and they're loaning it at the principal and the interest. So basically, if we take all of those U.S. Treasury bonds that are still outstanding that we haven't paid back yet, and we added them all together, well, that's the national debt right there. And the national debt includes both the interest that has to be paid back plus the principal on these federal securities or these U.S. Treasury notes. So, and we talked about how year after year, if we're in the federal budget deficit, that actually adds to the national debt. So every year that we do have a deficit within our federal budget, it's actually added to the national debt. So every year that we spend more than we make as a federal government, the national debt just goes up. So, if that's the case, let's look at the history. Let's talk about the history and where were we and how has the national debt changed over time. But let's go ahead and start back in World War II. In World War II, the national debt actually rose to $300 billion. Now, I don't know about you, but that seems like a lot of money to me. And that first occurred, or that $300 billion was back during World War II. That seems like a heck of a lot of money. Well, strap in, ladies and gentlemen, because we're going to see how that's actually just a drop in the hat. Because prior to the 1980s, the national debt, for the most part, was going to be tied to wars and recessions. You see, whenever we were in recessions, the United States government would enact some fiscal policies that we're going to actually talk about a little bit later in this chapter. Enact fiscal policies that would actually increase the federal budget deficit and make that federal budget deficit go up, adding to the national income. So whenever we were in wars, we typically had those federal, or not wars, but recessions, we had that federal budget deficit that added to the national debt. The other major times was during wars. You see, whenever we were in war, or at war with another country, then we would actually increase our spending on national security, on that national defense. And whenever we increase that spending, well, if you remember, that federal budget deficit is how much we spend minus how much we make. And if spending goes up, it actually increases that federal budget deficit, which leads into that national income. The higher the federal budget deficit is, the more we have in not national income, but national debt. The higher the federal budget deficit, the more national debt we have. So prior to the 1980s, the majority of the national debt would have been tied to both wars and recessions. But during the 1980s, that debt grew due to tax cuts. So remember, the federal budget deficit has two components: how much we spend minus how much we make. So if the amount that we're making in taxes is now being cut and we're actually making less, well, that creates a larger separation between the amount we make and the amount we spend, and our federal budget deficit increases, increasing our national debt. So let's dive into the 1980s, because some interesting things happened in the 1980s. First and foremost, in 1980, the United States government accumulated its first $1 trillion in debt. So during World War II, the end of the 1940s to 1950s, that era, We went from 300 billion, increasing by an additional 700 billion to the first trillion by 1980. So we increased our debts to now $1 trillion in 1980. By 1984, just 4 short years later, ladies and gentlemen, the United States national debt is now at $2 trillion. We have now accumulated $2 trillion in national debt by 1984. By the end of that decade, by 1990, essentially we have accumulated now $3 trillion in debt. So between the end of World War II and 1990, we're now increased from 300 billion to $3 trillion in debt. But we haven't gotten a handle on it just yet. By 2015, that debt has now increased to $7.7 trillion in that national debt. And it keeps growing. 10 short years later, we're at 19 trillion. Whenever I'm recording this video, it's in the year 2020, and it is expected to be $27 trillion in debt by the end of the year 2020. So let's dive into national debt a little bit more, and we're going to talk about national debt as a component of per capita. What per capita means is per person. So what is our national debt per person here in the United States? Because right now, if we look at it, we go from 300 billion to 1 trillion to 2 trillion to 3 trillion to 7.7 trillion, and then we just gonna go ahead and jump down here to 27 trillion. It looks like our national debt is beginning to be spiraling out of control. So what is that on a per capita basis, per person, per American citizen? In the 1950s, the national debt per capita was about $1,500. That means if we were to pay off our debt right now, every single man, woman, and child American citizen in the United States in the 1950s would have had to fork out $1,500. By 2015, the national debt per capita is now at $60,000, and that was at a debt of $19 trillion. So the debt per capita, or the debt per person here in the United States, seems to just keep increasing. So let's go ahead and judge this national debt as if it were private debt, because that's a good way to look at it as well. Is what if we were just acting as the United States was its individual business? So how are we going to stack up in terms of if it was private debt rather than national debt? So we're going to look at what is the debt to earning ratio. So in order to do the national debt and look at it from kind of that private aspect, and if we're going to look at it from a debt to earning ratio, we need to look at it as a national debt to GDP. Because what is our earning as a nation? Well, our earning is the sale of all final goods and services. That's also known as that gross domestic product, or GDP. So let's look at national debt to GDP. Unfortunately, the ratio is going in the wrong way. And what that means is our debt is increasing faster than our GDP growth. So, I mean, essentially what we're facing now is that the levels are kind of in line with the levels experienced during World War II. Basically, that our spending is now at the level of what it was, or our debt to earnings ratio. So our national debt to GDP is in line with what it was back in World War II, when we were spending massive amounts of money on weapons development and national defense and national security aspects during that World War II period. But essentially what's happening is national debt continues to increase. And what is our national debt? Well, it's the summation of all of the federal government securities, or all of those treasury bonds that are outstanding, both the interest and the principal. That amount tends to keep going up. And if we're going to look at it from a debt to earnings ratio, so a national debt to GDP we're going to see that ratio is actually trending in the wrong way.